Nobody told me the academy was in mourning. That part didn't make it into the transfer paperwork. What made it into the transfer paperwork was my name, my species designation, a biometric hash that took 3 attempts to scan correctly, and a room assignment in Block 7 of the Veth Carador Preparatory Corps, which, according to the intake sheet, was the most decorated officer-producing institution in the Sorthiin Compact. What did not make it in was the fact that the Commandant had died 4 days earlier, that the institution was observing a 40-day silence of form, and that no cadet was permitted to train, eat in the communal hall, speak above a murmur, conduct any physical exercise on academy grounds until the mourning period concluded. I found this out on day 3. Days 1 and 2, I spent unpacking, reading the orientation manual I'd been given on arrival, which was thorough on uniform regulations and dining, rotations, and completely silent on mourning protocols, and wondering why the training yard outside my window was empty at 4 in the morning. I assumed it was a rest day, maybe 2 rest days. The alien cadets I passed in the corridors moved like people in a dream, eyes cast down, arms folded across their chests in a gesture I would later learn was the sorthiin posture of deference to the departed. I thought they were just quiet. The sorthiin were a quiet species generally, long-limbed, gray-skinned, translucent secondary eyelids that they drew across their eyes when they were thinking hard. I'd read that much before I shipped out. I nodded to them in the corridors. They stared at me the way you'd stare at a man who walks into a funeral and starts rearranging the furniture. On day 3 I woke before the sun came up, which, on a planet with a 19-hour rotation, was not especially heroic. And I went to the training yard because I'd already skipped 2 mornings, and I could feel it in my back and in my shoulders, and in the specific kind of restlessness that starts behind your eyes when your body has been sitting still too long. I'd been running a circuit and doing bodyweight work since I was 14 years old. I was not going to stop because the yard was empty. It was a good yard. Wide packed earth surface, a long straight track around the perimeter, rack mount resistance equipment calibrated for sorthiin physiology, which meant the resistance started at roughly 3 times what a human would use recreationally, and a series of overhead bars set at a height that would have required me to jump to reach them even if I'd been a sorthiin, which I was not. I improvised. I ran the perimeter. I found the lowest setting on the resistance rack and used it for what it was worth. I did pull-ups on the lowest overhead bar, with a short box I dragged over from the equipment shed, because the alternative was doing nothing, and doing nothing was not something I was built for. I was halfway through my 3rd circuit when Drill Sergeant Vethosaurus found me. He was not a small alien. The Sorthiin are not a small species, but Osarak had the particular density of a man who has spent 4 decades turning soft cadets into something harder. Wide across the upper thorax, secondary musculature along his forearms visibly developed. The kind of stillness in his posture that isn't relaxation but compressed readiness. He crossed the yard at a controlled walk and stopped 6 feet from me while I was in the middle of a rep, and he waited until I'd finished and set my feet back on the box before he spoke. His voice was low. That was the mourning protocol. Everything low, everything measured. I didn't know that yet. "Cadet," he said, "this yard is closed." I stepped off the box. "Sir, closed for what reason?" He looked at me for a long moment. The secondary eyelids drew across once, slowly. "The Commandant is dead." I understood then, finally, the shape of the silence I'd been walking through for 3 days. I stood there in the early dark of a foreign planet and felt the weight of what I'd dragged my boots across without knowing it. I did not look away from him. "I didn't know," I said. "That's not an excuse. I'm sorry for the intrusion." He studied me the way you study something you weren't expecting to find. "You were not informed of the silence of form." "No, sir." "How long have you been in this yard?" 40 minutes, approximately. Another long pause. Around us the academy was still, the buildings pale in the first gray light, every window dark. 40 days of nothing. 37 remaining. "The Commandant held this yard," Osarak said, and his voice did something complicated when he said it. Not breaking, but shifting in register, the way a load-bearing wall shifts when the foundation settles. 40 years. Every recruit who passed through this institution passed through his hands first. We do not train in his absence. We observe, we wait. It is our way. I listened. He meant it as a statement of finality. The yard is closed, the explanation is given, the human will now go back to his room. I understood that. I also understood something else. Something I wasn't sure I had the right to say to a drill sergeant I'd known for 40 seconds. On a planet I'd been on for 3 days, I said it anyway. What did he train you to do, sir? When you stood where I'm standing. Sarek did not answer immediately. He trained us to be ready, he said finally, at all times, under all conditions. Then with respect I said, I'm not sure he'd recognize the yard right now. I want to be clear about something. I did not say it as a challenge. I did not say it as a provocation, or a lecture, or a clever thing to be remembered for. I said it because it was the truest thing I could find in the moment. And because in my experience, the truest thing is usually the only thing that does any work in a conversation like that one. I was a 19-year-old human cadet on the wrong planet in the wrong academy with the wrong paperwork, and I had no standing to tell a 4-decade veteran anything about grief. I knew that. But I also knew what 40 days of stillness costs a soldier's body. I'd seen it in people who came back from long deployments and couldn't sleep and stay still and couldn't stop moving because movement was the only language their nervous system had left. The Commandant had spent 40 years making cadets ready. Sitting down for 40 days in his name was not readiness, it was its opposite. Sarek looked at me for a very long time. Then he looked at the yard, the track, the rack, the pale-packed earth. His academy, quiet as a tomb. You have poor timing for a human, he said. I've been told, sir. He was silent for another moment. Then he moved to the resistance axe rack and stood in front of it with his arms at his sides, looking at the settings the way a man looks at a door he's been standing outside for too long. The setting you used, he said. Show me. I showed him. He adjusted it 3 increments higher. He wrapped his hands around the grips. He pulled. Trained for an hour in the gray light before the sun came up. No words, no ceremony. Just work. The kind that doesn't require an audience or an occasion. The kind that is its own justification. When we stopped, he stood breathing steadily, looking at the far wall of the yard with an expression I couldn't fully read. 40 years, he said. Not to me. And he never stopped. Not once. He walked back toward the main building without dismissing me, which I took as permission to stay. I ran 2 more circuits. The sun came up pale and cold over the academy roofline and lit the track in long, flat angles. And somewhere in the upper buildings, a light came on. Then another, then a third. By midday, the yard was full. I don't know what Osarek said to the instructors, or the instructors said to the cadets, or whether anyone said anything at all. The silence of form continued, voices low, heads bowed at the correct intervals, the full weight of the institution's grief still present and real and undiminished. It was not that they had stopped mourning. It was that they had remembered what mourning in that particular institution was supposed to look like. Not stillness, but continuation. Not stopping, going on in a way that honored why they had started. A sorthiin cadet fell in beside me on the track that afternoon. Young, maybe a year or 2 into training, secondary eyelids flickering with the effort of the pace. She did not speak, neither did I. We ran. That was enough. It was, I later understood, exactly what the Commandant would have wanted. A yard full of cadets doing the work, not because the grief was gone, but because the work was what the grief was for. I thought about that for a long time after. I still do.